to Canberra now and our Australian correspondent, Karen Middleton. Good morning, Karen.
Morning, Catherine.
Now, we're looking at moving into some easing in some states. I know Queensland will be gutted with the appearance of cases there, but what is happening in the some of the states that have been most heavily hit, particularly New South Wales?
Yeah, look, we can see the light at the proverbial end of the tunnel, I think, Catherine. We've hit more than 50% of all the over 16s across the country now vaccinated with 2 shots of a vaccine against COVID-19. So that's good news. I think 77% have had at least 1 dose. So we're now starting to see the various states, particularly New South Wales and the ACT, and then Victoria coming after, producing roadmaps out of lockdown, which is a great relief. I mean, New South Wales has been locked down for basically 3 months. Here in the ACT, we haven't been there for that long, but it's been heading up to 6 weeks. In Melbourne, somewhere in between. But of course, Melbourne's had 6 lockdowns now, and is, I think, officially the most locked down city in the world. So people are really over it. But what they're looking for is a magic threshold of 70 to 80% of people double dosed with the vaccine. They've done modelling through the Doherty Institute over here, and that has produced these thresholds and suggested that once we get ideally above 80%, that you can start to safely reopen the economy without having the massive transmission risk that would see the health system put under strain. Now, there are some people that question that and that are concerned particularly about which groups, which sections of the community would be most exposed if that's the case. Some people are worried about children, for example, who are still not vaccinated, very young children. Although the vaccination rates of children from the age of 12 up to 15 and 16 are now rising rapidly. So there are still a few hesitations about this, but basically we're starting to see some freedoms return. We're now allowed to gather in small groups outside. Here in the ACT from this Friday, we'll be allowed to go to another house. 2 people can go to another house. They're starting to have conditional reopening of some hospitality venues if they're serving food outside. So, we're starting to see, along with the weather warming up, the easing of these restrictions. And the Treasurer, the Federal Treasurer, has now indicated in the pages of our newspapers this morning that the government is going to turn off the tap of financial support for businesses 2 weeks after the nation reaches that 80% threshold, and that's designed to force people basically back to work. You'll be able to apply as a business individually if for some reason your sector still can't operate fully after that 80% threshold, but that's an incentive or a disincentive to stay shut.
Is that 80% 1 dose or 2 doses?
2 doses,
right,
yes.
Gotcha.
So the magic thing is the 2 doses. So we're at 52% now of 2 doses. Once the whole country on average gets to 80%, then that's when they'll open. But this is where we get into various problems with some states that have had less COVID and have got their borders locked. And I'll come to Queensland we'll come to Queensland in a minute. But just before we do, there are a couple of other things that have been flagged. The government's authorised our use of home use rapid antigen testing from the 1st of November, which again, once we're starting to open, is designed to give people the tools to test at home if they've got the sniffles or something, and that means they won't send their child to school or they won't go to the concert that might be on or some other gathering, and that's designed to try and minimise the risk of the spread once people are moving around in the community, because of course the Delta strain will run rampant as soon as the economy reopens, and those people in the 20% who aren't vaccinated will be extremely vulnerable. So there's that. And then the international borders are going to reopen at some point towards the end of the year. I think there's still doubt that we'll be fully flying overseas before Christmas. But, the airlines are hesitating, are gently starting to take bookings from the later part of the year. But there will be a clear distinction between the people who've been jabbed and the people who haven't. And that's going to be the case right across the country. And that's causing some disquiet too.
Just before we move to Brisbane, I can't help recalling the protesters. And I know there's been a lot of debate about how much of that protest ultimately were tradies and how much were, sort of various fringe groups who piled on in. But it's unfortunately a little bit of a hint of some of the stresses that might come when there are 2 worlds we're living in, the vaccinated and the unvaccinated.
That's exactly right. And there are people who are concerned about that. There are people who are saying that for whatever reason they don't want to be vaccinated or they can't for various health reasons or other reasons, and they're worried about having been penalised, and the state governments and the federal government are conscious of that and are trying to introduce a sort of phased-in system. Certainly in New South Wales, the Premier Gladys Berejiklian's been talking about that, phasing in these freedoms initially for the fully vaccinated, but ultimately she wants to get people who are not vaccinated allowed to go back to venues as well. But there is some friction about that. Even the police in New South Wales were saying yesterday, look, we're not going to be going door to door checking in every premises to make sure that every person inside has been double vaccinated. That's going to have to be a self-policing situation. So, even the authorities are starting to worry about exactly how this is going to work.
Now, the NRL, what's the risk here?
Well, good question. So, again, as a result of the lockdowns in the southern states, Queensland was going to host, or is due to host, the NRL, the Rugby League Grand Final this coming weekend. We saw the AFL Grand Final hosted in Perth last Saturday for the first time ever, with a victory to the Melbourne Football Club after something like 57 years in the wilderness. But Queensland's due to host the NRL Grand Final now, just as this is about to happen in a few days' time. They have got 4 cases of COVID-19, which they're very worried about, that have been circulating in the community. Queensland and Western Australia have been boasting that they've got no cases and they've been shut off from the rest of the country because of the situation in the other eastern states. So they've been under pressure anyway, and now, of course, something that people have warned about has come to pass, that eventually the Delta strain would pop up in these states. And indeed, these 4 cases in Queensland, one of them was an aviation worker who's infected his wife, and he's been circulating. Another one was a truck driver, and that was one of the examples that have been used by some of the epidemiologists and other experts in the space, saying, look, truck drivers are still crossing the border, somebody's going to infect someone. And unfortunately, this truck driver has been circulating for 8 days while infected. So they're very worried about that. At the moment, the Queensland Premier is insisting there's no plan to cancel the grand final. They've sold 50,000 tickets, but the Chief Health Officer, Jeanette Young, has been saying she is slightly alarmed about the situation. So they're watching this. They have a contingency to move the grand final to Townsville in Far North Queensland if need be. They're obviously reluctant to disrupt that if they don't have to, but there are epidemiologists saying it could be a massive super spreader event if it goes ahead, given the risk of virus circulating in the community. So some big decisions for the Queenslanders in the next few days.
Now, the climate wars. Of course, we're getting close to this Glasgow big meet-up, the big summit, really, or the COP26 latest round of global negotiations. Your PM's just been in the US, and what are the conversations around Australia and its climate plans?
Well, you remember we've spoken for years about the decades, really, of the climate wars here in Australia, and how we've just never managed to lock in any kind of system for reducing emissions at the national level. And now Australia is under significant international pressure with the change of administration in the United States. So the government is going to have to do something. There's huge pressure to announce a pathway to net zero emissions by 2050. Scott Morrison is in a difficult spot because he's in a Conservative coalition with the Nationals, a rural-based party that has long resisted that kind of move and any mechanism, and the Conservative wing of his own Liberal Party as well. But they are having to talk about it now. So Barnaby Joyce is back in charge of the Nationals. He is finally and surprisingly, I suppose, actually countenancing the prospect of net zero, but saying that he won't damage his own rural constituency or the mining sector, who they are now very mindful of these days as well. So there is some hard talking to go yet between those two parties to find a way there. And interestingly, Scott Morrison is now suggesting he may not go to Glasgow. So that's quite interesting, because we'd all assumed he would, and he'd want to be on the world stage and he'd want to have something to say there. But whether that's a hint that we may not be seeing as dramatic a shift as some people might like or not is unclear. But he's been quite happy to go to other international meetings, as we say, just in the US recently with the Quad meeting and meeting President Biden, but he may not be turning up at Glasgow. So they've yet to lock this final decision in, either on the contents of the policy or on whether or not he'll show up.
Just around 90 seconds or so to go. Do we have time to just update on this scrap with France over the submarines deal?
Bit of fallout, nuclear fallout, pardon the pun. Yes, Australian defence industry very worried about the impact on it. The French company Naval Group, the French government-owned company, had undertaken that it would spend at least 60% of its $90 billion contract value in Australia using just Australian industry. And now, of course, that won't be here. So there's a great deal of concern about the economic impact of that. There's also concern about the diplomatic impact of not telling France before it cancelled the contract abruptly. The French are still snubbing us. Our Trade Minister, Dan Tehan, is supposed to be going to the OECD in Paris shortly, and the French are refusing to meet with him, just as President Macron refused to take Scott Morrison's call. So a bit of schmoozing to be done, unsurprisingly, yet with the French, Catherine.
Over a nice bottle of Bordeaux or something. And very quickly, nice to congratulate you on things other than sport, always. Moulin Rouge and its Australian connections has been, they've been toasted at the Tony Awards.
Correct. They've won 10 awards at the Tonys. Australian company that invests in sport called Global Creatures at Sport, and started out in caravan business. The caravan businesses diversified to theatre, bought the rights to Baz Luhrmann's Moulin Rouge, and swept up the Tonys. So we're very happy for them.
Congratulations.
Nice work.
Thanks, Karen. Karen Middleton is our Australian correspondent.